So, Nina, again, thank you for coming to Prague. Thank you for an inspirational talk. I think I will follow up with asking Johanna and Robin to introduce themselves for the audience.
We're being very polite. My name is Robin Bennett, and I look after what we call our international program at the Creative Byrokracie Festival in Berlin, which basically means everything that takes place outside of the German-speaking region. So things like the collaborations that we have here in Prague would be a great example.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us here. Nina, super thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really inspiring. When you were talking about your career, for a moment I was thinking, are you like 70 years old? Because you have done so many things. So I'm the director of the Creative Byrokracie Festival in Berlin, and I myself have actually never been a public servant. So before I started with the Creative Byrokracie Festival, for 5 years I was helping people that were new in Germany to kind of like deal with the German bureaucracy. Because at times it's pretty inaccessible, it's hard to understand forms. It's really, after all, at many times a design problem and an accessibility problem. So after 5 years of doing that, I thought, well, I actually want to do something on a more systemic level and see how does government function, how can government change. And then I actually saw a Creative Byrokracie Festival exists. I went over and I was like, hi, I want that job, can you please have me? And well, 4.5 years later, we are all here, and we're very happy that the Creative Byrokracie Festival is not only in Berlin, but also here in Prague.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you all for coming here. I was in Berlin last week for the first time, and by how huge the conference is. It's if you imagine that there's about 200 people here on Festival kreativní byrokracie here in Prague, it's like 1,700 in Berlin now, was it?
Almost 1,900.
Yeah, it's just like it's rock for people, you know. Imagine it's like a rock festival, and it's really cool to see so many people interested in the topics and enthusiastic about it. But also, I feel like it's also cool sometimes to see that other countries are struggling with similar problems. You know, sometimes it feels like we're the only ones that love paper forms, and we're the only ones that are drowning in bureaucracy. And then you come to Germany and you listen to the German minister talking about how much they love paper forms, and you're like, yes, good. It's not just us. So that's also, in a certain way, maybe inverse of inspirational, but at least it gives you a peace of mind that we're all struggling with the same issues. Now, I think I'd like first to start with kind of a brief history of how it even started. How did Creative Byrokracie Festival start? You've been running it for 7 years now, I think, is that right?
Yeah, we just had the 7th edition, yeah.
Wow, congratulations, it's awesome. So, how did it started and how you've kind of seen it evolve over the years? I think maybe, you know, to give a little bit of sense of kind of how the times are changing perhaps and the festival is reacting to it.
Sure, sure. So yeah, we didn't always have almost 1,900 people who said like, I'm a bureaucrat and I'm creative and it's perfectly fine to be both. So it all started more than 10 years ago with a book that our festival president, Charles Landry, maybe you've heard about him, he wrote a book. He's like an urban strategist and he consults cities on like better city planning and more human-centered city planning. So he wrote a book back then which is called The Creative Byrokracie and Its Radical Common Sense. And actually back then with that book, he first came up with the idea that creativity in bureaucracy actually belongs together. That a good government, a good bureaucracy needs creativity to function. It needs out-of-the-box thinking, it needs like new ways to imagine societies, all of that. And that basically anyone can be creative. It's not only the work of artists, but like anyone can say, I design a new government, I design a new form, I design a new system, and that is the creativity that we need. So that was the book, and it came out and was great. He was invited to talks and everything was lovely. But then at a conference, he met a man called Sebastian Turner, who was back then the publisher of one of the biggest newspapers in Germany. And he said, well, creative bureaucracy is not enough of an oxymoron. Let's make this a festival. So this was, and then in 2018, they started this with a couple of hundred people, and everyone was really surprised about how many people came and that it really hit a nerve. So 2018, 2019 was great. Then we went for 2 years to the digital world, which was really nice. And then we returned in 2022 to an on-site festival with around about 1,000 people. And that was already a great sign to see, well, we're actually really having a party here. We are celebrating creativity, or as one person from our audience once said, it's like a spa day for bureaucrats. It's where you feel seen, it's where you feel heard, it's where you really recharge your energies. And yeah, that's what we've been building on ever since that. And then actually 3 years ago, we heard from Matej, the organizer of the hub here. He was like, we should bring that to Prague. And well, here we are.
Spa day for bureaucrats. That explains why Matej came back with these wide open eyes and full of excitement. Yes. So you mentioned COVID and kind of going into digital for 2 years during COVID. In fact, I was thinking about Nina and the jump in innovation in healthcare that followed in the COVID years. And in a way, it kind of got me thinking about, things suddenly seemed very simple when it comes to innovating and when it comes to kind of introducing change into healthcare. It seemed simple when we all had a shared sense of urgency. But then, since then, that shared sense of urgency has gone away. And I think what I'm guessing that some people in the audience might be wondering, how do you kind of introduce change into a system that has got a lot of continuity and momentum because of just the sheer number of people involved? How do you kind of start with introducing the design process and the design thinking into that kind of context?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I guess in all of these things, even in my story, like context matters. So you mentioned with healthcare, I remember there was a lot of resistance in the United States to do telemedicine. And then and they were like, no, that'll take many years, that will take many years. And then COVID happened and suddenly it happened, right? And so I think even in all of the things that we're trying to push forward, it's making sure the context is right for it too. So they say when you write an op-ed, for example, you should write it ahead of time, and then when it's the right climate, that's when you submit it to the publisher. And so I think sometimes when we're pushing for more innovative solutions, it might not be pushing for it all the time, but when it's the right moment to do it.
That actually resonates with one of the topics that I felt like was in Berlin last week, which was, if you're designing for change, sometimes it's better to avoid fighting the system and just kind of design something and store it in your drawer and then wait for the right moment. I think it was Tamara who was quoting, never let a crisis go to waste, right? I like that quote. Do you feel like you've seen that change over the years, on the Creative Bureaucracy Festival? How do you feel like that's been evolving over the years? Is it one and only COVID, and then the urgency has gone away, or has it been kind of shifting around as kind of things are evolving? Maybe Robin.
Yeah, totally. I think one key conversation that's come out of the festival, both this year and last year, across contexts, is how you create those conditions of urgency without necessarily having to repeat the crisis of COVID on an annual basis. And one area that comes back to often is this notion of relationships being the essence that we have to build first in order to make anything happen. So there's a guiding quote that I like to hone in on from a community organizer in the States, that social change happens at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust. So a lot of the work that we're doing is finding those individuals in different geographies, predominantly from currently in the public service, but particularly in politically less stable environments. Sometimes it's those on the outside who also care about working in the public interest and feel connected to creative bureaucracy as a mission. Finding them and helping them to realize who else is speaking their language, even if they're using different words for it, and building those relationships of trust across typical, say, hierarchies within ministries, across sectors if necessary, and then together working out how you can build that momentum of relationship around some kind of common goal that creates the equivalent urgency without necessarily needing a crisis. So that's the sort of theme then that you see take different directions because different people sort of mobilize around different topics. But that's come out quite clearly for me, at least. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Johanna.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned, the topic of trust is so important. And that's really something that we've seen change over the year. Because, Nina, what you say, experimentation is so important. It's really like, it doesn't work without it. Because otherwise, you have some strategy, you go for it, but you actually don't know if it's going to work. And you need trust in your team, in your surrounding, to actually be able to experiment and to be able to fail. And I feel like after COVID, this has definitely gone up. We see this in the communities because this was the time where in some parts, of course, failure wasn't really possible, but because things happened relatively fast in a completely unknown environment, you just had to trust the people around you. You had to trust the citizens, and that definitely has gone up ever since, and it's something I see in the communities, and that's very, very good. But also, it's a real call. We need to continue to create the trust, because in that system of urgency, we need to trust each other to be able to experiment, to foster real change.
Yeah, there's also been some really interesting studies on trust building, because I think across the world, trust in institutions and trust in government has gone down dramatically. But that it's not inherently human for somebody to trust an institution, right? That trust is actually built through relationships. So I think about that sometimes, even as we're meeting different people from different communities, how important, it's like you are the face of government, right? You are the face of this institution, and so much of their belief in that system is going to be based on the personal relationship they have with you.
And in fact, it resonates with something that I really loved on the festival. You had a keynote speaker, the German Minister of Justice, right, whose name just escaped me, I'm sorry. But he said, and I loved that, he said, if we create laws that don't trust the people and that have to be so absolutely watertight that, nothing slips through, then how do we expect the people to trust us? Right, and I love that idea of let's pull back a little bit and maybe just have kind of overarching laws, but let's not kind of micromanage every little detail and trust people to a certain extent, and maybe they will trust back into the government. I find that a lot of the trust is very culture dependent, right? And very different between countries. And Nina, you've lived in a lot of countries around the world, so you probably have a lot of different experiences to compare. And even from the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, there's just so many people that come in. I was very surprised by how strong your Asian section was in Berlin, and how many people came from Singapore and other countries in Asia. And sometimes that feels a bit like, you're listening to people talk about trust, and you're like, well, I come from a completely different background. In my country, we have to micromanage everybody down. In fact, it was here in the morning today, we've listened to the gentleman talking about how if it's not in the law, it's not going to happen. It has to be in the law, and there's absolutely no room for any interpretation. So my question is, how do you kind of, navigate this in different cultural environments, right? The situation where, for example, I find that the Anglo-Saxon kind of Commonwealth law is a lot more loosely defined and leaves a lot more for implementation and a lot more to be decided by the courts. And then here in Central Europe, and even I think in Germany and in Czech Republic, we have these laws that are very prescriptive and very clear about what everybody has to do. I remember the 12,000 reporting requirements that the German minister has mentioned. So that's a very different cultural environment, right? And maybe less trusting, is it that? Or how do you kind of navigate that to the creating trust when you're operating in a cultural environment like here in Central Europe?
I think, so the way that our program is designed in Berlin was actually by accident to start with rather than by design, but it has ended up making a lot of sense. So we have half of our program in German, and that enables us to reach from the most innovative and creative-minded German bureaucrats who also speak English and are looking outwards to the rest of the world, and maybe are slightly more outward-looking and creative with how they interpret the red tape that they encounter, all the way through to your much more straight-laced, run-of-the-mill, middle-of-the-road bureaucrats.
So cue for the audience. If you're sitting in the audience, you're the outward-looking innovative. Congratulations.
And we started that way too, actually. Like, it was only that crowd that attended to start with. And then on the English side of the program, you've got examples that are more of that creative, innovative nature from different parts of the world. But as we've grown, what we've seen is that bringing examples of how different countries are tackling the same problem, like this obsessive focus on the problem, not the solution, has enabled people who would typically think and operate within the tight confines of the red tape that they're used to, starting to think about how they could deal with things differently. And then on the other side, people who are coming from much freer contexts, like Germany is there's a reason that they wanted us to do the festival, right? It's quite a bureaucratic country in that regards. Seeing how other countries are still achieving the same outcomes with a different approach, and that started to make change happen on the ground. So I feel like having that balance of the two, sort of respect for places where it is harder to innovate and acknowledging that, but also the sort of glimpses of hope, we found that balance to be quite helpful.
Also, like speaking from the German context, we actually see really a bit of a difference between our German institutions and the international ones that are at the festival. So when people say about Germany that it's quite a regulated country, regulated government, it definitely many times is the case. And for me, it's great to see how many, like German, actually also quite conservative institutions come to the festival, because we can really see what we build is like room for change. And I feel like if there's room for change that we can create, then there's a room for trust. Because it's like when as a government, you really think you need to have every single thing regulated. It's also something you don't have the space for mistakes. And that's, I think, where it's really good to actually connect civil servants from all different countries to see, hi, this is where it works differently. This is where we have all that trust and we have that room to make mistakes so we can take it back. And I think Germany definitely needs a Creative Bureaucracy Festival, and it's great to have the space there in the public sector that people are like, I love this, let's continue with this and let's continue to learn from each other.
Okay, now a regular reminder that I ask the audience for questions. So I will just do a quick check. Anybody have a question yet? I have been told by the organizers that if you're not going to come up with the questions, the organizers will. There, thank you. I have lights pointed in my face, so I missed you, I'm sorry. Now, could I ask my lovely assistant, thank you.
Okay, I actually have a question for Nina, or maybe perhaps also all of you, but I would like to ask about some tips how to actually persuade the civil servants that design thinking is the process to go forward with innovation in public sector.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I've experimented with a lot of different ways. I actually now don't even use the word design. So in this talk, I used it over and over and over again, but I'm like, if it's really the way of thinking, how do I find the words that they're already using to describe the process so it doesn't feel like this new thing that they need to learn, but maybe enhancing something they're already doing. I've also tried to, this is more of like the interpersonal thing, but listen a lot to my coworkers and what they see are the big problems. I work with a lot of scientists, and they're hard scientists, so it's definitely different than working with engineers or business people. And I've tried to make them advocates for it. So when I hear, the research they're doing, I'm like, you know what would be great? What if you could do blah, blah, blah? And they're like, oh, that is really cool. And it becomes their idea, not mine. And I've found that the happiest moment to me is when I'm in a meeting and somebody is saying my idea, but it's like they're saying it as their own, and having no ego because we're like, yes, it's gonna happen now. So yeah, getting other people to feel ownership over it is another way.
Great, thank you so much.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
One thing that I think has worked really well, especially in a like a more like not this like where you think, oh, those people are doing innovation all the time and those type of contexts, is to create a bit of a sandbox environment. I know a lot of German ministries are doing that because there is so much fear that once it's out there, it's out there. We can never take it back. It's the public sector. And so basically that the idea is once it's out, we can't have a mistake in there. It needs to be perfect. So to create a sandbox environment where new systems, new regulations aren't out in the world yet, but people can experience how does it feel to be working with them. Because I think that's super important, relates to a lot what you said, Nina, like people need to feel how it works because that really takes away a lot of the fear of what might happen if it's out there. So I think sandbox environments really make a lot of sense. And then once this has gone for a bit, you take it out in like a beta phase and then it's out there. And then it's like, all right, we know how it feels. Everything is great.
And maybe one final thing to add there. We've had a lot of feedback over the last couple of years in particular that having the examples from other countries who tried have gone ahead with an equivalent approach, even if it's not quite the same, but tackling a similar problem area, provides really useful legitimacy when going to then particularly up the rank to a senior leader, but also convincing colleagues of why something should be tried. So that's also what we're trying to do, to provide those examples that people can then run with and get the trust and legitimacy they need.
And talking across organizations. I think that is so important. It's like the seeing example from different countries, but then there can always be the excuse of like, oh, in our country it doesn't work because of this and that. And this like, it's been such a like a buzzword and kind of annoying, but like this breaking down silos, it's so important to be talking across organizations, because if it's in the same geographical context, the same legislation system, it's like if another ministry has done that, it kind of would work for mine as well. Maybe not exactly like that, but a lot could potentially work. So I think that's really important in order to make change work, to be talking to each other and not only to the people who are always sitting right next to me anyways, but to the person across the desk, across the office, in the next building, the next country. Like that's super important. There is a new online system for registration of some kind. So they start designing it, but it's not being like out in the world immediately, but they first go through it and design it in the team and have the team test it, etc., etc. So it's not right away out in the world. And then the old system still exists at the same time, and it's kind of like a safe space where also the developers can make mistakes and everything is okay. Group that would test it, but it's still not, let's say, the real car registration system, but more like we have built the whole system, we try it out, and then people can test it and can see how it works. So that would be about a real digital application, but also about how do teams work together. For example, that like several ministries have a regular exchange about how things could work together. It doesn't become like a law of you have to do this all the time, but more like we try it out, we see how it works, and if it works, we actually make this a real cooperation between the ministries. But that's more of a step-by-step safe process to create this like environment of safety for everyone.
I will have a follow-up question. So one of the things that I love is comparing and contrasting where lessons can be learned from public sector, from private sector, and from businesses, and kind of replicated in the public sector, right? And I feel sometimes we feel the private sector is completely different, but if you focus only on the very large companies, on the corporations, then they often struggle with similar problems as the public sector, because there's just a lot of people, so a lot of momentum, and in the public sector, this kind of innovation sandbox that you're talking about are often like the innovation labs within those corporates, right? And one thing that I find hard to replicate in the public sector is those innovation labs often have rules that, they break rules that are hard and fast for the rest of the company, right? The rest of the company has one way of budgeting or whatever, and then the innovation lab doesn't quite have the same rules. And often that's because what you're trying to do is not just replace one IT system with another IT system, but you're trying to change the way people work or people organize themselves. And so the same processes that are true for the rest of the company cannot be true for this little hub of innovation that's trying to shake things up. But I find that very challenging to replicate in the public sector, where things are often codified in law and much harder to innovate around. Have you found a way to kind of sandbox the law out there?
I think actually it's a great idea to sandbox the law. I just heard this like 2-3 weeks ago. There was a conversation about one of the labs, an AI lab in Germany, and someone was like, "Oh my God, but they are not working according to the rules and the laws." And someone else said, "Yes, that's exactly what they should be doing, because it is a lab, it is a sandbox environment." Because through working against the law, we also see where the law isn't applicable to the current status quo that we have, because technology is moving quickly and lawmaking isn't. So it's really, really important that the people that make the law take it into consideration. What are the technological times we're actually living in? And this, to really find out, you also need the sandbox for that. You need that lab where people say, hey, in order to provide good government service, we had to break the law here, 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 and here, and then this needs to get circled back to the people who make the law. They don't need to change the law right away, but it needs to be taken into consideration that if we want to build good government services, there might be these and these things in the law that need to be changed. Like, in Germany, there for a long time, people had to hand sign a lot of things. That doesn't work right now at all. So you need a lab where okay, let's just try it out. Digital signature all over. How does it feel? How does it work? How does the application look like? And when then they, in that lab, see in the sandbox, they see it does work, they can be like, hey, lawmakers, we actually need to get rid of the hand signature. It's about time. And then they also have proof of it. It's not just some person who's like, let's stop signing things by hand, but they can say, we have tested it, we have proof, we need to change it. And then it's a really good back and forth. And I think this can be super fruitful.
Maybe just to add to that, one key conversation that's come out of particularly international discussions beyond Germany, I mean, it's the case there as well, is that there's a lot of people who would say that they've lived and died in public innovation labs the last 20 years. And sometimes what you need is the creation of new institutions and or new roles in order to catalyze the kind of change that's needed. So I think RH in a US context maybe is a good example. In Wales, about 10 years ago now, they introduced a Future Generations Commissioner and act alongside that to embed the rights of future generations within law, and then sort of built the equivalent policy structures needed to make that take hold, which is now having an influence in other countries too. And I think it's important to note that depending on, it's not just political stability, but still, depending on the environment that you're working in, the culture at hand, a lab model's not always going to be the right solution. But I think if you do some kind of mapping of who the key actors are that are trying to push for the type of change that you want to see, then you can work out what's missing and try and push for the creation of either roles or new structures accordingly.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing. The other thing that I've seen a lot of labs where they fall down is the teaming. So oftentimes the people in the lab might be like, let's say it's like an automobile company. There's a lot of designers and things like that in the lab or strategists, but there's no engineers, right? Or in the context of government, there's no lawyers. And then what happens is you come up with a solution and then you put it in front of this audience and they're like, this is why it can't work. This is why it can't work. And I think that we need to be a little more creative on those teams. And I think spending a lot of time in the team building, which nobody wants to do because it takes a lot of time, is really important. And so when we create these diverse teams in labs, a lot of times their skill sets are very different. So someone might have a legal background, an engineering background, a design background, a technology background. But within that, there's some sort of overlap that they have. And usually it's in their mindset. So I remember when I worked at American Express, we'd want to launch new products and we would talk to the legal team and they would always tell us, no, you can't do it, you can't do it. And it would be so discouraging, right? But then we'd work with this one lawyer. I was like, what if we could do it? How would that look like? And that was a very different conversation, right? And so how can we get to more conversations like that? Or how do we find the right talent, either from conversations or interviewing, that are open to having those conversations?
So one slogan out of the Creative Byrokracie Festival that I absolutely love, and I'm not quite sure if we found a suitable Czech translation yet, is moving from no because to yes if, which is precisely what you talked about, right? And finding the allies in your organization that are in the yes if department rather than no because. So we have about room for 2 more questions. So in case you have a question, now's the time to start raising your hand. I can see one over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is probably for Nina or for anyone else who can answer. I'm from Česko.Digital and we are trying to help the public sector to use the potential of technologies. And we see that the way to go in is through the systemic change. But the thing that we are struggling with is to find a way how to create the demand for systemic change. Because if you don't have the demand, it's really hard to try pushing something through the closed door. And that's connected to funding, that's connected to all sorts of other things. Do you have an example of how do you create this demand? Or any experience in that level?
Yeah, I think that's where I'm a bit lucky in that the agency that Robin mentioned, it's the whole model is high risk, high reward. So oftentimes when people come with a solution, they say it's not big enough, right? So I think the context in which I'm working is about systematic change. I think sometimes it's, I feel like it's, people often say this, but it's the storytelling behind it. So linking what's going on in the agency with the, but these won't be successful unless we also have this, right? So one of the techniques that I've been using is around futures. So how, creating, there's different types of methods you can use. There's scenario planning. Sometimes they even use sci-fi as a way, or speculative fiction. So, this is the world that we want to create. And then everyone kind of gets behind that. Yes, that's the world we want to create. It's okay, what do we have to be doing now in our strategic planning to make that world possible? So that's been an interesting way of storytelling to get people rallied around it, because oftentimes, like, in the United States right now, we're having a lot of conversations on equity, but we don't really know what an equitable society looks like because we've never had one. And so starting to paint that picture makes it a lot clearer.
And how do you then get the funds behind it? Because we can rally people, I don't think that's a problem. We can paint a beautiful picture, but when it comes down to the money, they say, but I want to see something happen in next 2 years, next year. What can I get for that cash I give you? And that's a problem with the systemic changes.
Yeah, so I think it's measurement's really important. So you have to figure out some way to measure it so that you're showing progress. So we talked about trust, for example. Trust is something that's really difficult to measure, but there are attempts at doing it. So we have NPS scores in the private sector, net promoter scores, but there are also similar NPS scores for trust. And sometimes it could just be little bits of data that are informal, but kind of using these methods of tracking can also be really helpful in showing some sort of progress. So it could be in terms of mindsets, it could be in terms of number of people who want to do business with the government. I think it's being a little creative in your measurements too.
Thank you.
Out of interest, who is it that's saying no to additional funding? Where's the no coming from?
Because we are NGO, we are funded usually from private sector, so private sector entrepreneurs, angel investors. So what we get is, fine, this is important what you do, I really, really want to do that, but because it takes such a long time for them, it's not something that they would be so much willing to give cash for. So they go for, okay, so what can I get in the next year? So we have to kind of find a projects that are on the ground that actually create some change and fund the systemic change from that. So we take the money, but let's say 30-40% goes to the systemic activity. Yeah.
What I was just going to add to that is sometimes once you've got the groundswell of enough actors working in the same direction, I think sometimes creating these new entities, which isn't necessarily a decision that you would have, but kind of getting enough people pushing for that same agenda of then creating, I mean, that's what happened in Wales. They ended up with this then legally enshrined act and role, whose job it was to push these types of agenda forwards, and that came about because there were enough people for a long enough period of time who'd pushed for that type of change to happen. And then trying to attract a blended set of particularly finance actors, but collaborators in general who are pushing for the same agenda. That can sometimes help with the story to move things forward, but it's not going to, the kind of change, systemic change that you're after won't happen at the speed that angel investors in particular are looking for. So giving yourself a little bit of credit for that as well, and maybe looking a little bit wider. Yeah, sorry.
One room for one question. There is a question back there, all the way at the top. You can do it. Woo. Nope.
No,
One down.
It's a fake out.
Yep. Oh. Was there no question? Sorry, I thought you were raising your hand.
I can ask it then. I ran the stairs already, so I can ask it if you want.
All right. If there are no other questions, then Matej, you can raise your hand.
It's going to be the same question I ask every year. I'll probably ask Nina, but you can all give me your answers. And that is, I find it very challenging to cooperate and collaborate, work together across sectors, when one sector included is one that's generally looked down upon by the society. So civil servants in here, as in so many other places, are often seen as either incompetent or lazy or whatever. And there's so many saviors out there, people like myself, like Jakub, Nina, who come from different sectors, saving civil servants. And Jindřich Fridge, who was here in the morning, I think that's my favorite quote of his, and it's the nightmare of every civil servant. You know, you wake up in the morning being saved by some savior who just came around the block. So my question to you, Nina, is how do you make it possible for the US civil servants, which I believe would be, in this case, in this respect, similar, how do you help them get on the same board, same page with you when you are this, foreigner in the sector coming for help with this title of a innovation fellow, which sounds scary as it is, even without any further sentences added to that. So how do you build this? I know I've asked that. I know you mentioned it in your speech as well, but I think it'll take me a few years to find the right answer before I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Yeah, so when we're talking about trust, right, I think it's not just with citizens and the government, it's also building trust within the organization. I noticed that when I would introduce myself on calls, it was like everyone was a little, like, standing a little straighter. It was on Zoom, so maybe they were sitting a little straighter. And there would be, like, when I would talk about my background, there'd be like it felt like a little stuffy. And then I noticed that when I added this one detail, the context would totally change. So I was moving from New York City to Washington, D.C., and I would talk about that. And I'm like, but I actually grew up in Washington, D.C., and both my parents were civil servants. And it's like everyone on the call would immediately be like, like they just like could like let loose a little bit. And I thought that was so fascinating. And it's like, to your point, maybe I was like, oh, that's interesting. Was there some sort of feeling of like judgment that I was judging them or like looking like, thinking about them in a certain way? And the moment I said that I had parents who were civil servants, it changed the dynamic. Like, oh, I have a respect for the profession. So I think it kind of goes to like empathy building or even finding some sort of commonality that you have with the person. Once again, we don't have trust in institutions, we have trust in people. So starting with that. Even in design research, we have that, when you're interviewing someone, there is a conversation curve. And when you are maybe like every culture is different for where you get to it, but you only start asking the really deep questions after you've built a certain level of trust. And so the same way as you're building relationships within organizations or within an organization, how do you almost think about maybe what's holding the person back and showing that we can meet halfway or we have something in common?
Thank you.
Robin or Johanna, do you want to add? We've been talking about trust most of the time, I feel like, revolving around the trust and patience and never letting a crisis go to waste. It's lovely to see the topics kind of coalesce around common themes.
I think the only thing I wanted to add there, that's kind of where the Creative Bureaucracy Festival idea came from, in so much as bureaucrats, public servants often get bashed for what they're doing badly. People speak badly of them or just get frustrated. And even if you're in those types of roles, it's sort of, you're not encouraged to celebrate what you're doing. And that's kind of the point of the festival, is creating that space where these individuals are celebrated, and all of the visuals that we put together for sessions are all people's faces. It's sort of celebrating those individuals in these roles in a way that they aren't usually afforded. So I think that just, backs up what Nina said.
So I will steal the last 30 seconds, and I want to tell the audience one thing. They have a really awesome spa for bureaucrats in Berlin, and you really ought to go. I think it would be lovely if the organizers reach out to the participants and attendees this year and offer to coordinate some kind of, chartered private plane to Berlin, or maybe a bus or whatever else. But I would love to see more people from the speakers and from the audience to come and also see that sometimes the problem we're trying to tackle here are problems that other people are trying to tackle elsewhere as well. And that sometimes there is light at the end of the tunnel, or at the very least, there is a shared feeling of we're not alone in these problems and we're in it together. So I would very much encourage you to go and visit the rock festival that the Berlin Creative Bureaucracy Festival is. And thank you for coming to talk to us today, all the way to Prague. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Enjoy the festival.
Thank you.